701 BCE, Ancient Lachish. King Sennacherib's engineers roll 120-foot wooden towers toward the city walls, while 185,000 workers construct mechanical nightmares in full view of terrified defenders. Picture this: you're standing on those limestone walls, watching your own execution being built piece by piece, the sound of hammering echoing across the desert like a funeral drum. But here's what no history book tells you: only 12% of Assyrian sieges required actual combat. The other 88% surrendered before a single stone was thrown. You can almost hear the desperate whispers of mothers telling children that tomorrow, maybe tomorrow, the nightmare machines will stop growing taller. Here's the shocking truth: these weren't just siege engines, they were the world's first industrial-scale psychological warfare machines, designed by military engineers who understood human breaking points better than most modern psychologists. Imagine watching Dr. Martin Seligman's famous learned helplessness experiments, except instead of laboratory dogs, it's your entire civilization being systematically conditioned to surrender their will to live. In the next 25 minutes, you'll discover the 3 psychological principles that made these ancient machines unstoppable, why archaeologist Sir Austen Henry Layard called them engines of terror rather than war, and how the exact same mental manipulation techniques are being deployed against your mind through your smartphone, your workplace, and even your city's skyline right now. The siege engines broke spirits before they broke walls. Here's the 3,000-year-old playbook that's still controlling you today. Step into the year 800 BCE. You can smell the dust and sweat of Mesopotamian plains, where the Assyrian war machine was perfecting something that would make modern military psychologists weep with admiration. While neighboring kingdoms still relied on crude battering rams and siege ladders, Assyrian royal engineer Nabu-Zur-Kitty-Lishir was documenting systematic psychological torture techniques on cuneiform tablets. Picture walking through the Assyrian royal archives in Nineveh. Archaeologist Sir Henry Rawlinson discovered over 26,000 clay tablets in 1849, many containing detailed blueprints not just for building siege engines, but for maximizing their terror impact. You can almost feel the cold clay between your fingers as you read instructions like, "Position the assault towers where all defenders can observe daily construction progress." But here's what makes this truly disturbing: Professor Robert Sapolsky's research at Stanford University shows that chronic anticipatory stress causes the same brain damage patterns we see in siege warfare victims from 3,000 years ago. The Assyrians had discovered what modern neuroscience calls weaponized anticipation. These weren't medieval siege engines. Imagine mechanical skyscrapers on wheels, some standing 100+ feet tall, requiring 300–500 workers and 6–8 months to construct. The psychological genius wasn't the size, it was the visible, methodical construction process that defenders could watch day after day like a countdown to their own death. Dr. Judith Lewis Herman's research on psychological trauma reveals that prolonged, inescapable stress causes specific brain changes, the same neural patterns archaeologists now recognize in skeletal remains from Assyrian siege sites. The victims' bones show stress markers identical to modern PTSD patients. You can almost hear the rhythmic hammering across desert sands, smell the smoke from forges working day and night, feel the ground vibrating as massive wooden wheels turn closer to your walls. This was industrial-scale psychological warfare, the systematic application of terror through engineering precision. Modern corporate restructuring, urban gentrification, and social media algorithms use identical psychological principles. The slow, visible approach. The display of overwhelming, inevitable power. The message that individual resistance is futile. The Assyrians weren't just building weapons, they were conducting the world's first mass psychological experiments, and they kept detailed data on human breaking points. Picture this scene. It's dawn, 701 BCE, and your commander Shebna defending Lachish's southeastern wall. You can taste the limestone dust in your mouth as you watch something that will haunt human warfare for millennia. Assyrian chief engineer Nebuchadnezzar Ukin Zeri surveying your walls with bronze measuring tools, sketching angles and distances with the calm precision of a modern architect planning your funeral. You can almost feel the cold morning air as you realize this isn't a traditional army approach. These are construction crews, hundreds of them, unloading tools and timber with organized efficiency that makes your blood freeze. They're not here to storm your gates in a heroic charge. They're here to systematically dismantle your psychological defenses before they touch a single stone. Dr. Bruce McEwen's groundbreaking research on stress hormones explains exactly what's happening in your brain as you watch this unfold. Your amygdala fires continuous danger signals, flooding your system with cortisol, but there's no immediate threat to fight or flee from. You're trapped in neurological purgatory. Watch the first siege tower take shape over 21 days of psychological torture. Day 1. Just timber foundations. You tell yourself it's nothing serious. You can almost hear your own nervous laughter echoing off the walls. Day 5. The wooden skeleton rises 30 feet. Sleep becomes difficult as the reality sinks in. Picture tossing on your bedroll, hearing every creak of construction in the distance. Day 12. Walls and floors added, warriors visible through windows like passengers on a death train. You can almost taste the metallic fear in your mouth as you realize they're building multiple towers simultaneously. Day 21. The tower now looms 120 feet tall, casting shadows across your city like the wing of a mechanical vulture. Imagine standing in that shadow, feeling smaller and more helpless with each passing hour. But here's where Assyrian psychological genius truly shows. They understood what Dr. Robert Cialdini calls social proof in his research on influence. As you watch fellow defenders beginning to crack under the pressure, their despair becomes contagious through mirror neuron activation. You can almost hear the whispered conversations changing tone week by week. Week 1. We can hold out. Week 3. Maybe we should negotiate. Week 6. Why are we even fighting? The siege engines become personified monsters in the defenders' minds. Archaeological evidence from Lachish shows graffiti where defenders named the tower's death's door, the Iron Wolf, Stormbringer. They weren't just fighting weapons anymore, they were battling symbols of inevitable doom that had invaded their psychological landscape. Then comes the Assyrian masterstroke, the testing phase. Picture watching a completed battering ram swing once through empty air, its massive bronze-reinforced head whistling with bone-crushing force just 200 yards from your walls. You can almost feel the ground shake as 2,000 pounds of engineered destruction demonstrates its power. Modern military psychologist Colonel Dave Grossman's research shows this is identical to psychological techniques used in advanced interrogation, showing the subject exactly what will happen to them, then making them wait in anticipatory terror. You realize you're not just defending a city, you're defending against weaponized inevitability itself. Every day of construction is another day of your hope being systematically murdered by engineering precision. Coming up, how the Assyrians discovered that human minds break faster than human walls, and why archaeologists found children's toys scattered in panic near Lachish's gates. Here's where ancient warfare meets cutting-edge neuroscience. the Assyrians had accidentally discovered psychological principles that Dr. Martin Seligman wouldn't formally identify until his famous University of Pennsylvania experiments in 1972. Picture your brain under siege conditions. Dr. Amy Arnstein's Yale research shows that chronic stress literally shuts down your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for strategic thinking and hope. Meanwhile, your amygdala becomes hyperactive, trapping you in permanent fight or flight mode with no resolution. Imagine this happening to 10,000 people simultaneously. You can almost feel the collective despair spreading through Lacash's narrow streets like psychological contagion. Dr. Elaine Hatfield's research on emotional contagion explains why seeing your neighbor's terror literally rewires your own brain through mirror neuron activation. The Assyrians exploited what modern psychology calls anticipatory anxiety disorder. Picture this. You can see your destruction approaching. You know exactly how it will happen, but you're powerless to stop it. Dr. Michelle Krask's UCLA research shows this creates more psychological damage than sudden trauma because it gives fear time to metastasize through every aspect of daily life. You can almost taste the metallic anxiety in your mouth as weeks of visible construction trigger what Dr. Robert Sapolsky calls psychological time dilation. Minutes feel like hours. Days stretch into eternities. A 2-month siege feels like 2 years of torture because your stress-flooded brain can't process time normally. But here's the truly diabolical part. The Assyrians understood learned helplessness before it had a name. When you repeatedly face overwhelming threats you cannot overcome, your brain literally stops generating solutions. Dr. Christopher Peterson's research shows this creates permanent neural changes, hope pathways physically deteriorate. Picture the impossible cognitive dissonance tearing apart defenders' minds. I must fight for my family versus fighting is useless. Dr. Leon Festinger's research on cognitive dissonance reveals this mental conflict creates such psychological pain that surrender becomes psychologically relieving. You can almost hear the conversations inside Lacash's walls changing. Month 1. Strategic planning sessions. Month 2. Desperate prayers to gods. Month 3. Whispered discussions about surrender terms. Dr. Judith Herman's trauma research shows prolonged, inescapable stress causes specific brain damage. The hippocampus memory center shrinks, while the amygdala fear center enlarges. Skeletal remains from Assyrian siege sites show identical stress markers to modern PTSD patients. The social fabric disintegrates predictably. Dr. Stanley Milgram's research on social breakdown shows that extreme stress dissolves community bonds in specific patterns. First, class divisions become extreme as wealthy families hoard resources. Next, family units fracture as parents make impossible survival choices. Finally, leadership collapses as officials flee or break down. Imagine walking through Lacash during month 3. You can almost smell the unwashed bodies, hear the crying children, feel the paranoid glances between neighbors who once trusted each other. The siege engines haven't just surrounded the city, they've infected it with systematic despair. Dr. Bruce Alexander's addiction research reveals why this psychological torture was so effective. Humans need social connection and hope to maintain mental health. The Assyrians systematically destroyed both, creating what modern psychologists recognize as trauma bonding with the aggressor. Surrender becomes psychologically attractive because it ends the unbearable suspense. Coming up, the chilling archaeological evidence of how these psychological weapons worked in real time, and why modern corporations use identical techniques in workplace restructuring. Now, witness siege engine psychology in devastating action. Because the archaeological evidence from Lachish reveals something that will make your blood run cold about human nature under systematic pressure. Dr. David Ussishkin's excavations between 1973 and 1987 uncovered the exact sequence of psychological collapse, preserved in ash layers and abandoned artifacts that tell a story of methodical mental destruction. Phase 1. The mathematics of doom picture defenders obsessively counting every day. 185,000 Assyrian workers versus 10,000 city residents. You can almost feel the spreadsheet of despair calculating in their heads. We're outnumbered 18.5 to 1, just by construction crews. Dr. Daniel Kahneman's research on cognitive biases shows humans naturally overestimate overwhelming numerical superiority, amplifying the psychological impact. Archaeological evidence shows defenders carved hash marks into walls counting days of construction, measuring tower heights, calculating approach angles. They were literally quantifying their own doom like an accounting problem, engaging in what Dr. Susan Nolan Hoeksema calls rumination disorder, obsessive mental rehearsal of threats that amplifies anxiety. You can almost hear the desperate mathematics echoing through stone corridors. 7 siege towers, each 120 feet tall, approaching at 50 feet per day. We have 12 days left. Phase 2, the theater of inevitable death. Here's where Assyrian psychological warfare becomes pure genius. King Sennacherib's engineers staged what archaeologists call demonstration parades. Picture complete siege engines rolling in formation around the city walls, not attacking, just displaying their mechanical perfection like a military parade of death machines. You can almost feel the ground trembling as bronze-reinforced battering rams swing through empty air, their massive heads whistling with 2,000 pounds of engineered destruction. Dr. Albert Bandura's research on observational learning shows that watching violence demonstrations creates more psychological trauma than experiencing random attacks. The defenders could see exactly how they were going to die. Siege towers deploying scaling ladders like mechanical fingers reaching for their walls. Catapults test firing stones that landed precisely 50 feet short as range demonstrations. Archers loosing volleys that fell just outside the gates like preview trailers of their own execution. Phase 3. The waiting game. Torture. After demonstrating overwhelming power, the Assyrians would often stop. Complete engines sat motionless while emissaries discussed surrender terms. Dr. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment reveals why this waiting period was pure psychological torture. Anticipated punishment creates more mental damage than actual punishment. Picture living in constant maximum alertness. Every sound might signal the attack. Every movement might herald the beginning of the end. You can almost feel your nervous system burning out like an overloaded electrical circuit, unable to maintain peak stress indefinitely. Archaeological evidence shows the psychological breakdown. Children's toys scattered near the walls, abandoned mid-play as families fled in terror. Household items hastily buried in courtyards by people desperately hoping to return someday. Personal jewelry thrown into wells. Families preferred destroying their treasures rather than letting Assyrians claim them. Phase 4. Social fabric disintegration. Dr. Sebastian Junger's research on social cohesion explains what happens next. Extreme stress dissolves community bonds in predictable patterns. Wealthy families begin hoarding food while poor families starve. Parents make horrible choices about which children to save. Community leaders either flee or collapse under pressure. You can almost smell the paranoia seeping through Lachish's narrow streets. Neighbors accusing neighbors of cowardice, desperate finger pointing to blame someone, anyone, for the impossible situation. The siege engines hadn't just surrounded the city, they had infected it with systematic social dissolution. Phase 5. The data collection. Here's the most chilling discovery. Cuneiform tablets from Assyrian archives show they documented everything. Which psychological tactics worked fastest? Which cities broke down at which phase? Which demonstrations most effectively triggered surrender? They were conducting systematic experiments in mass psychology, treating entire populations like laboratory subjects in what modern researchers would recognize as unethical human experimentation on an industrial scale. Professor Sarah Parchak's satellite archaeology has identified over 300 Assyrian siege sites across the Middle East, each one a data point in humanity's first psychological warfare database. They were building an encyclopedia of human breaking points that could be referenced for future conquests. Coming up, how these exact same psychological principles are being deployed against you through corporate restructuring, urban development, and social media algorithms, and why you probably haven't even noticed. Here's where this gets personal and terrifying, because every psychological principle that made Assyrian siege engines effective is being deployed against your mind right now. Through systems so sophisticated, they would make ancient psychological warfare experts weep with admiration. Let's start with corporate siege warfare. Picture this scene. Amazon's HQ2 search process, a modern siege engine approach, where 238 cities competed desperately for the privilege of being conquered. You can almost feel the municipalities calculating their submission offers, measuring their chances, becoming collaborators in their own economic siege. Dr. Shoshana Zuboff's Harvard research on surveillance capitalism reveals how tech companies use identical Assyrian tactics. The slow, visible approach of data collection. The display of algorithmic power through targeted advertising. The message that privacy resistance is futile because everyone else has already surrendered their data. Ever notice how corporate layoffs are announced months in advance? This isn't inefficiency, it's pure Assyrian siege psychology. Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer's Stanford research shows that anticipatory job anxiety causes more psychological damage than sudden termination, because it activates the same learned helplessness pathways. Picture yourself watching corporate siege engines approach your department. New management consultants appear like Assyrian engineers, surveying workflows with tablets and measuring tools. You can almost taste the metallic anxiety as they build restructuring plans in glass-walled conference rooms, conducting psychological warfare in full view of their targets. Urban development deploys identical tactics. You know that sick feeling when massive construction cranes appear on your neighborhood horizon. Professor Sharon Zukin's research on gentrification shows developers deliberately choose slow, visible construction specifically because it triggers anticipatory displacement anxiety in existing residents. They could build these projects quickly and quietly instead. They choose the methodical Assyrian approach that lets you watch your community being systematically replaced, month by month, year by year. The cranes become modern siege engines, mechanical giants reminding you daily that change is inevitable and resistance is meaningless. Social media platforms have weaponized anticipatory anxiety. Dr. Adam Ghazali's UX research shows that infinite scroll algorithms create the same neurological patterns as Assyrian siege conditions visible, overwhelming content approaching endlessly, while your attention span is systematically destroyed. You can almost feel your focus being methodically dismantled as you scroll past content designed to trigger microdoses of anticipatory stress, political catastrophizing, relationship anxiety, career insecurity, Health fears. The algorithm is your siege engine, rolling new threats toward your mental walls every few seconds. Political systems use siege engine psychology masterfully. Campaign seasons stretched across years, building anticipatory anxiety about election outcomes. Dr. Drew Weston's research on political psychology shows that extended political uncertainty creates identical stress patterns to siege warfare, chronic anticipatory dread that exhausts cognitive resources. You can almost hear the psychological hammering of 24/7 news cycles, constructing mechanical monsters of inevitable political doom that approach your mental walls day after day, year after year. The message is always Assyrian. Massive forces are approaching. Individual resistance is meaningless. Surrender your agency to larger systems. Even relationship dynamics fall victim to siege engine psychology. Ever experienced someone threatening to leave but never actually going? Dr. John Gottman's relationship research identifies this as emotional siege warfare, the slow approach, visible preparation for departure, psychological pressure of inevitable loss. Your emotional walls crumble long before they actually walk out the door, exactly like the defenders of Lachish surrendering before the siege engines ever attacked. Coming up, why understanding these patterns is your first step toward psychological freedom, and how the same principles that made siege engines effective also reveal exactly how to resist them. Let's decode the universal pattern that makes siege engine psychology so devastatingly effective across cultures and centuries. Because understanding this system is your roadmap to psychological freedom. Dr. Steven Pinker's research on evolutionary psychology reveals why we're vulnerable to siege engine tactics. Humans evolved to submit to overwhelming displays of systematic power because fighting hopeless battles meant genetic extinction. The Assyrians weaponized our survival instincts against us. Picture your brain during siege conditions. Dr. Antonio Damasio's neuroscience research shows that when facing systematically overwhelming threats, your prefrontal cortex, rational planning, shuts down while your limbic system, emotional survival, takes control. You stop thinking strategically and start thinking only about submission. The three-phase pattern appears across every siege engine system. Phase 1. Magnitude overwhelm demonstrate power so massive that cognitive processing breaks down. Dr. Barry Schwartz's research on choice paralysis shows that when options seem infinite and threatening, the brain simply stops generating solutions. Phase 2. Temporal torture make the approach slow and visible so anticipatory anxiety has time to metastasize. Dr. Sonia Lyubomirsky's research on rumination reveals that extended threat anticipation causes more psychological damage than sudden trauma. Phase 3. Social proof cascade engineer situations where surrender appears logical and socially acceptable. Dr. Robert Cialdini's influence research shows that when authority figures and peers display submission, individual resistance becomes psychologically unthinkable. But here's what makes modern siege engine psychology truly insidious. The system tricks you into participating in your own psychological destruction. You're not just passively suffering, you're actively scrolling social media that destroys your attention, researching changes that increase your anxiety, staying informed about threats you cannot control. Dr. Sherry Turkle's MIT research reveals this creates collaborative helplessness. You feel like you're taking action, gathering information, staying engaged, while actually deepening your psychological submission to systems beyond your control. The historical pattern reveals siege engine psychology's fatal weakness. It's ultimately unsustainable because it requires massive resources to maintain the illusion of infinite power. Every siege engine system in history has eventually collapsed for the same reason. It's built on theatrical fear rather than genuine strength. The Assyrian Empire, despite its psychological sophistication, fell to the Babylonians in 609 BCE. Why? Dr. Joseph Tainter's research on societal collapse shows that maintaining siege engine psychology becomes so resource-intensive that it eventually bankrupts the system deploying it. Modern siege engine systems face identical vulnerabilities. Corporate surveillance capitalism requires enormous energy to maintain algorithmic manipulation. Urban gentrification depends on continuous capital investment to sustain displacement pressure. Political psychological warfare exhausts resources maintaining artificial crisis conditions. Once people recognize the theatrical nature of overwhelming power displays, the psychological grip weakens rapidly. Dr. Gene Sharp's research on nonviolent resistance documents how entire oppressive systems can collapse surprisingly quickly when populations stop being afraid of artificial demonstrations of power. The key insight, most overwhelming modern power, is actually carefully curated theater designed to trigger your evolutionary submission responses. Corporate headquarters deliberately dwarf human scale. Government buildings project authority through architectural mass. Media campaigns emphasize individual action futility. But siege engine psychology has an Achilles heel. It only works when people believe the power demonstration is real and permanent. Dr. James C. Scott's research on hidden transcripts shows that resistance often develops underground before suddenly erupting to topple apparently invincible systems. Your ancestors survived the Assyrians not through superior military might, but by eventually recognizing that much of the overwhelming power was psychological theater. The siege engines looked invincible until people stopped being afraid of them. Understanding this pattern doesn't just protect you from manipulation, it reveals opportunities. Every modern siege engine system has the same vulnerabilities the Assyrians did: resource intensiveness, dependence on fear maintenance, and collapse when people share information about how the system actually works. Coming up, your practical roadmap for psychological resistance, and why knowledge of siege engine psychology makes you more dangerous to modern manipulation than any ancient warrior ever was to the Assyrians. So here's the revelation that changes everything about power, resistance, and your daily psychological battlefield. The Assyrians discovered humanity's greatest vulnerability. We can be controlled more efficiently through systematic psychological manipulation than physical force. They learned to break spirits before walls, weaponize anticipation itself, and turn our evolutionary survival instincts against us. But here's the twist that transforms victims into warriors: the same psychological principles that made siege engines devastatingly effective also reveal their exact weaknesses. Once you recognize that most overwhelming power is carefully orchestrated theater designed to trigger your submission responses, the psychological grip begins dissolving. Picture yourself now, armed with 3,000 years of siege engine psychology knowledge. When corporate cranes appear on your horizon, you recognize the Assyrian playbook. When social media algorithms flood you with anticipatory anxiety, you see the siege engines approaching your attention. When political systems manufacture extended uncertainty, you know you're being psychologically sieged. The defenders of Lachish surrendered because they didn't understand they were being systematically manipulated. You do. That knowledge makes you more dangerous to modern siege engine psychology than any ancient warrior ever was to the Assyrians. Your mind is under siege every day by forces that understand your psychological vulnerabilities better than you understood them until now. Corporate algorithms, urban development, political manipulation, relationship dynamics, they're all using the same 3,000-year-old playbook. But siege engine psychology has always had the same fatal flaw. It requires enormous resources to maintain the illusion of infinite power, and it collapses rapidly once people stop being afraid. Every siege engine system in history has eventually failed not because they were defeated militarily, but because people learned to recognize the psychological manipulation. The siege engines are still rolling toward your mental walls through your smartphone, your workplace, your city skyline, your political landscape. But now you have what the defenders of Lachish never had, understanding of how the system works. Use that knowledge wisely. Recognize the patterns. Resist the psychological theater. Share the information. If this video revealed how your mind is being systematically sieged, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Next week, we're exposing how Roman gladiatorial games were the world's first mass media mind control experiment, and why your favorite streaming platform uses identical psychological techniques to capture and monetize your attention. The siege engines are approaching, but now you know how to defend your mind.